Dr. Hopkins, forensic dentist, conducted the examiner's office, conducted an examination, looked at the x-rays, looked at the fillings, looked at the dimensions of the teeth, and was able to make a conclusive determination that the skull that was found in April 1999 was in fact the skull that belonged to Melissa Wolfenbarger, because the dental records matched the impressions that she took from the skull. It was a match. That's when all the location of the job, that's when all the location of the house, the location of the extremities, and the skull between the job, that's when all that comes in. And that's already a suspect. That's when they're really focusing on this. You know what he says? Same thing. She just left. Then he says, oh, well, I dropped off at a train station. You're going to hear those statements from him. And you're going to hear the detective's questioning him about those statements in that explanation. As I said, the skull is identified by Carl Patton. There were two medical examiners during that period in 1998 when we first started, through 1999 when we first started their examinations. Dr. Carl Terry and Dr. Joseph Parker. Dr. Joseph Parker is no longer living, but you will hear from Dr. Carl Terry, who will tell you that she examined the extremities. She'll tell you that she examined the skull and that they appeared to have evidence of tool marks. And she'll tell you that her expert opinion is that Melissa Wolfenbarger was murdered. The circumstances of her lifestyle, how she was living, what was happening to her, the circumstances of her remains, the condition that they were found in, makes it highly likely that she was murdered. That's what she'll tell you. Tina Patton is the sister of Mrs. Wolfenbarger that you will hear from at some point today. Melissa told her that Chris was responsible for the bruises on her neck. You'll hear from Norma Patton, Melissa's mother. She was told about the battery in July of '98. Melissa told her mother that she wanted to leave this defendant. She told him that he was abusive. You'll hear from Thomas Dixon, who Melissa was seeing. Probably one of the last persons that Melissa saw. He also has information that he's going to tell you about how abusive this defendant was from Melissa's own mouth. And you're going to hear from Christina Garrett. Christina Garrett is the daughter of Melissa Wolfenbarger and Christopher Wolfenbarger. And the one thing she'll tell you is that she recalls her mother. And one thing that kind of stood out is she just remembers her mother kind of disappearing one day. And she'll tell you that one of the oddest things that she cannot reconcile is almost immediately after Melissa just vanished, this defendant essentially just removes all of her stuff out of the house. You can see the pictures of mother, belongings, and things of that nature. It's gone. While she was growing up, she would constantly ask him, "Where's my mother?" And you would expect that you would have heard an answer at some point, some type of explanation, where she would tell you that he never answered her question. He never told her I looked for her. He never told her I ever reported her missing. Nothing. In fact, she will tell you that this defendant would tell her while he was growing up that he knows how to get rid of a body. He knows how to not get caught. He also told his daughter, and you will hear this from her mouth, that he had a place to go on the run if he needed to. Now, Christina Wolfenbarger grew up in basically being cared for by Kathy Wolfenbarger, Christopher Wolfenbarger's biological mother. She lived in the house until she was You're going to hear that when she left the house of grandmother, when she was able to get out on her own, that's when law enforcement gets that information from her, around 2015, 2017. That information about what he told her while she was growing up. You're going to hear from Dorothy Jones. Now, Dorothy Jones is a resident of that neighborhood at that around the 800 Brookline Road area, close to the Action Glass Company where Christopher Wolfenbarger worked, close to the location where Melissa Wolfenbarger's skull was located, close to the location where Melissa Wolfenbarger's remains were located. Dorothy Jones is familiar with that location, and essentially what she's going to tell you is she pretty much hung out with Christopher pretty much every day during that period. She remembers him. She remembers Melissa. She remembers seeing signs of Melissa being abused. She would tell you that she saw Melissa with the black eye herself. That she had been punched in the eye. She's also going to tell you that she's heard them fighting at that house, glass breaking. Probably the most disturbing thing she's going to tell you is that she saw him every day for about a 10-year period. And just one day, Melissa was gone, never saw her again, and Chris was gone. And she says, not only gone, but just kind of left all this stuff. It's in me. You're going to hear about the signs of trauma. There are going to be some photographs that you'll see solely for the purpose of illustrating the tool marks, the mechanical device that was used to disconnect the limbs of Melissa Wolfenbarger. And most importantly, you'll hear this defendant's own statement. During that 1999 period, he told the officers that he was fired because the owners thought he stole a saw. He admits to borrowing it. He admits to using it to cut the top off his car. He never got the saw back. And you'll hear from the anthropologists, the detectives, the medical examiner, that there are signs that Melissa Wolfenbarger's remains have been solved. You also hear about the day he was arrested, 2024. And it did not go like a typical execution of a warrant for homicide, because it took quite a bit of time to locate this offender. In fact, they didn't locate him in the residence portion of the house. They located him in the side area to the garage that was situated for living space. They found him in a something that looks the evidence to show it has the appearance that it was created for the purpose of the house. That's what the evidence is going to show. After about 40 to 50 minutes, they get the dogs, and you just can't hide from the dogs, right? The dogs hit, come on out of there. You see, that's what you're going to hear. When he crawls out of there after an hour, and the evidence is going to show he knew exactly who was at his front door. It will be your determination, your decision as to why. I'll submit to you. It will be clear why. It will be clear. They were there to finally arrest this defendant for the murder of his wife. Arrest this defendant for dismembering his wife. They were there to arrest him and hold him accountable for taking Melissa Wolfenbarger from her mother and sister, most importantly, her children. At the conclusion of this case, the evidence, testimony, the exhibits, you will be left with one decision, and that's to vote the truth. And I submit to you, the truth will be guilty. Both counts in the state indictment for the murder of Melissa Wolfenbarger in 1989.
Thank you. Mr. McDermott, does the defense wish to make an opening statement?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, you may proceed.
We can all agree that Melissa Wolfenbarger did suffer a tragic death. And you haven't yet heard the extent of which she had suffered a tragic life. But the extent of her suffering in life and in death had nothing to do with Christopher Wolfenbarger. The state's story begins correctly. This is a case about a horrifying discovery of human remains that later became identified as Melissa Wolfenbarger's. But the evidence will show you over the next few days that the state's story has gaping holes in it. And that the state is going to ask you effectively to imagine in order to connect the dots between those gaping holes. To fill the gaps, if you will. What the state has declined to tell you in this case is far more important than what they have told you. And your job over the next few days is going to be to see those gaps, to refuse to imagine, and to demand proof of all the elements of the crime that is charged beyond a reasonable doubt. You're going to hear evidence, some of it from their own witnesses, that multiple other individuals could have had something to do with Melissa's death, starting with her own parents. You've heard mention already of the Flint River murders. Melissa's father, Carl Patton, committed a string of murders in the late 1970s. He was suspected of those murders for a long time. He was investigated, but they were not prosecuted and proved until 2003, 4 years after Melissa's disappearance and death. You'll be presented with evidence that Norma Patton, his wife, helped him directly commit at least 2 of those murders, to dispose of the bodies, to clean up the crime scenes, and to wrap up the bodies and dispose of them in ways that are somewhat similar to the way Melissa's remains were found. Carl, Melissa's father, died in prison last December. Melissa's father eventually confessed to killing 5 people. Some of those were for personal revenge. Some of those were contract killings for money. And at least 2 of those were murders of his own friends because they knew too much. All of the victims were either close friends or family members. In one case, Carl knew how to stage a crime scene. He turned what was a shooting to look like an accident of a car on train tracks.
Your Honor, I object to the defense's content of their opening statement. The statements made by counsel are just simply irrelevant to any issues that are presented during this trial.
As previously discussed, they're going to be relevant to third-party guilt and motive story.
I'm going to overrule the objection on relevance grounds. I am, however, going to request that you, in line with our earlier discussion pre-trial, limit some of the details unless and until that evidence is presented to the jury.
I will not get into any more granular detail than I have so far.
Thank you.
Satisfactory?
Yes, sir.
Melissa's mother in 2 of those murders was a co-defendant. She confessed to planning 2 cold-blooded murders, cleaning up the blood, bleaching the floor, etc. And the murders from which the name that comes to those murders is the Flint River murders, is because one of those bodies was dumped in the Flint River. the other in the Altamont River. And the only reason Norma didn't go to prison like Carl did was because she got immunity to testify against him. And she'll be here to testify this week. The evidence will show that there is also a Patton family associate who also had very strong motives to kill Melissa. We're trying to get him prosecuted for allegedly molesting her in the 90s, and also because his father later turned out, to his knowledge, was one of Carl's victims. And until he learned that, he was a family friend and hung out with the family. And that man's name is Eric Martin Jackson. You'll find out later that at some point Martin learned what Melissa's father had done to his father. And he goes and buys a series of burial plots at a cemetery in 1997, a year before Melissa goes missing, or maybe a year and a half. And he buys them in the very cemetery that Melissa is buried in today, and later, because later he sold those plots to her family. And there are others I'll touch on in just a minute. We expect Norma Patton to come here and testify that she had a loving relationship with Melissa, that Melissa loved her, communicated with her, stayed in touch with her, tried to get away from Christopher's control every chance she could get, so she could come back to Norma's home and see her. But the evidence is going to show that Melissa was actually abused by her mother in her own home for many years and started running away frequently. Her mother locked her in a room all day, every day, from roughly ages 7 to 12. The evidence will show that their home was so foul and dirty that Melissa acquired a foul smell in her clothes and hair that made the other kids at school bully her and tease her. You'll hear evidence from Melissa's next-door neighbor and childhood friend that she will detail the abuse that she endured in that house. Moreover, at some point before Melissa ran away, her sister Tina had a pregnancy in that house, delivered the baby in the house secretly, and tried to dispose of it secretly in a clothes hamper in the house. 13-year-old Melissa discovered that baby's corpse. She eventually told school officials, who later called the police, and it was at that point that Melissa began running away from her home regularly. Christopher, in fact, first met Melissa because she ran away from home. And through a mutual friend, they met at that mutual friend's house. Now, Christopher and Melissa eventually got married, and they did so fairly hurriedly. They were both 17 when they got married. They had 2 children, very young, in very close succession. When Melissa was still pregnant with her second child in 1996, she went to Christopher's mother, Kathy Wolfenbarger, who will testify that Melissa asked her if she would take custody of their children temporarily. And she did. When Melissa got in some legal trouble the next year in Gwinnett County and went on probation for theft, it was after that that they began to, that's when they moved up to Brookline in July of '98. Their children lived with Christopher's mother in Stockbridge and later in Locust Grove, Georgia. When Christopher and Melissa moved up to Brookline in 1998, the children did not go with them. Now, you've heard some talk about an incident that happened in July of 1998 when Melissa took out charges against Christopher. You also heard the state tell you that Melissa came back and dropped the request for that protective order. What they didn't tell you is the very next day, Melissa calls Kathy Wolfenbarger from the Henry County Superior Court and asks her to please come down and sign the papers to make her custody of those children permanent. To make Kathy's custody of Melissa's children permanent. And Melissa permanently relinquishes her parental rights to those children. One of the reasons Melissa originally gave for giving her children over to Kathy Wolfenbarger, and she tells this to Kathy, and she tells this also to Christopher's sister independently, was that she did not want her parents to have anything to do with her children because they are bad people. After relinquishing her parental rights, Melissa quit working around that time at the Waffle House in East Point with her sister, and for some reason begins randomly working at a Waffle House clear up in Doraville. No one knows why she went up there. According to everyone, no one had any connections up there, friends or family or anything. But she goes up there and starts working. Melissa started spending more and more time in Doraville, days at a time, working double shifts, spending the night at someone's house, and then multiple days, and days turned into weeks, she would be gone from Christopher's house. And it was at that time that she had started seeing Thomas Michael Dixon, the state mentioned a while ago. We'll have a chance to cross-examine him. In October of that year, Melissa got arrested in Gwinnett County for violating her probation, and she spent 30 days in jail until early November. The terms of her probation required her to do community service. This was outstanding through 1997 still in effect. She was to do community service, she was to take GED classes, and she was to report regularly to her probation officer, and she had not done any of that. And so they arrested her, gave her 30 days in jail, and then released her back on the same terms of probation. Within 1 month, she is already violating her probation again. Although she was not rearrested at that time. So at this point in her life, Melissa was spending as much, if not more, time in Doraville as she was at Christopher's house. She only occasionally came back to see Christopher. She had her own job. She had her own money. She had her own circle of friends. She had her own freedom. She had no obligations to her children. And so when in December of 1998, she did not come home for several weeks or months, Christopher could safely assume she had decided to live her own life on her own terms, wherever she decided to live. Moreover, if Christopher had raised a stink about it at the time, Melissa was in violation of her probation. She would have been arrested. Melissa's mother, Norma, is expected to testify variously, as you've already heard, that when she didn't hear from Melissa at Christmas in 1998, that's when she knew something was wrong. Alternatively, however, she will testify that no, it was not until my birthday rolled around. That's when I knew something was wrong. She will tell multiple versions of this story. In one version of the story, well, let me back up. The evidence will show you that in multiple versions of the story, whichever version she tells, she never reports Melissa missing until 2000, January of 2000. If something was wrong in December of 98, something was wrong in February of 99 on her birthday, something is wrong a month later, a month later, a month later, her mother doesn't report it. She doesn't file a missing persons report until 2000. The human remains in this case, as you've heard, were found on Avon Avenue. It's an industrial area near the west end of Atlanta. The evidence will show that it just so happens Melissa's father, Carl Patton, was familiar with this area. He grew up in a childhood home on Main Street in College Park. It's just a few miles down the road. Further, the evidence will show that Norma and Carl actually went up to Brookline Street right after her birthday in February of 1999. They found Christopher's empty house at that time. They learned from a neighbor that Christopher had moved out sometime between Christmas and New Year's. They also learned that from that neighbor that Christopher worked at Action Glass down on Avon Avenue. So they drove down to Avon Avenue and talked to the people at Action Glass. And they learned that he had been let go there. Again, this is February 1999. Carl and Norma Patton knew where Chris worked and where he lived months before the head was found on Avon Avenue, right beside where he worked. The state is correct that Melissa's mother and sister are going to testify against Christopher. They're going to blame him. They're going to call him a domestic abuser. But there's a lot of context you don't know. Keep in mind, as we've already said, the evidence is going to show that Melissa only met Christopher when she ran away from home. The evidence is also going to show you that Norma Patton has consistently, out of her own mouth, stated that she absolutely hates Christopher. From the very first time she ever saw him, she hated him. She worked and did everything in her power possible to prevent Christopher from seeing Melissa. When he was 16, would not let them date, or tried to prevent them from dating. Tried to prevent Melissa from leaving the house. Tried to prevent them from getting married. She tried to force Melissa onto birth control so that she could not get pregnant. Melissa's older sister joined that opposition to Christopher as well. We'll hear it admitted from her own mouth that she did not like Christopher. No one in her family liked Christopher. And that she tried everything she could perpetually to intervene in Christopher and Melissa's marriage to get Melissa to leave Chris. The evidence is going to show that any claims of abuse or bruises on Christopher's part only began to be generated after Melissa started working with Tina at Waffle House. And the evidence of claims of abuse only come from witnesses who came under the influence of Norma and Tina. Christopher and Melissa, as I said, had 2 children, Chrissy and Joey. Chrissy was born in August of 1995, Joey 11 months later. Again, the state is going to present testimony from Norma and Tina, who will say that Melissa would never under any circumstances have abandoned her children. She would not have just left and never kept contact with her children. Impossible. But we already know that, in fact, she did legally abandon them. And the evidence will show that she also practically abandoned them. As I said earlier, when Christopher and Melissa moved up to Brookline Street, the children didn't come with them. They stayed way back in Stockbridge. The children were raised by their grandmother, believing that she was their mother. In September of 1998, when Melissa started leaving for large portions of the time with her work friends and her new lover, Thomas Dixon, she rarely returned to Brookline Street, where Christopher was. She even less hardly ever went down to Stockbridge. You will hear testimony that she rarely visited her children during this time, and that she rarely ever even called them during this time. Whatever Melissa's own personal aspirations might have been in regard to her children, the one thing we do know is the evidence will show that she rarely ever contacted them, and all but forgot about them. You'll hear testimony from Christopher and Melissa's own daughter, who's now grown up, of course. Her name is Christina. Some call her Chrissy. She will testify as a state's witness. She will say that she remembers to the day when her mother disappeared and all the pictures and belongings were removed from the house. Again, the evidence will show that she didn't live in that house. She lived in Stockbridge. The evidence will show you that at that time, Chrissy was every bit of 3 years old. Moreover, Christopher and Melissa's children didn't live in that house, as I said. Chrissy will also tell you that years later, she remembers Christopher making these offhand comments about he knows how to get away with murder, and the key is to hide the body, or to put it under the foundation of a house that's being built so they'll concrete over it and no one will ever find it. And there are various versions of that story. Christopher's son, Joey, who's also now grown up, will also testify, and he will say he was in the room when such comments were made. And that Christopher was speaking in the context of the boasts that Carl Patton used to make, who was a known killer. We'll have evidence in this trial that early in their relationship, Carl hired Christopher to help him in the roofing business. Chris spent time around Carl and heard him say these things. Even Chrissy will admit that when Christopher made such comments, it was contextual within a discussion and had nothing to do with Melissa whatsoever. Chrissy will also admit that everything she knows about the case, she learned from Norma Patton. Remember what I said at the outset. The state's going to present little points of circumstantial evidence, and they're going to ask you to use your imagination to fill in the gaps. Here are some of the gaps I want you to pay attention to. The state will not present any evidence of a cause of death. The state will not present any evidence of a murder weapon. The evidence obviously will show that there were remains that were discovered and that there were marks on the bones. But those wounds are all post-mortem. The state will present you with no evidence of how she died. The state will present no evidence of when she died or where she died. The state will present you with no evidence of where she was dismembered or when or how she was dismembered. They won't present any evidence of how she was transported to the site in the condition that she was. The state will provide claims about a saw that went missing from Christopher's work, allegedly around the time that Christopher was there. No evidence will show, even though the state claims otherwise, that he stole a saw from them, or that he was terminated for that reason. Furthermore, there's no proof that the kind of tool that actually made the marks on these bones was a saw. If so, what kind of saw? We have no evidence of what type of saw it would have been. We've got no evidence that will show that markings are distinctive of this reciprocating saw that was taken versus the circular saw he mentioned when he started his story. Furthermore, your common sense will tell you that there are about a literal million saws in the state of Georgia. Anybody can access a saw. Anyone can access a wide variety of types of saws. You'll hear from investigators from the APD. They will admit that once Melissa's remains were identified, they searched Christopher and Melissa's house on Brookline Street. They searched every inch of the home, inside, outside, every room, basement. They sprayed the entire house with a reactive agent that discovers drops of blood. Not a single drop was found. They took paint samples from every room. Why? Because when Melissa's head was examined, there were chips of paint in her hair. There were synthetic fibers in her hair. And forensic evidence will show that. The fibers were, in fact, found to be consistent with some kind of a bath mat or even a carpet. Very broad category. When Melissa's remains were the paint samples of her remains did not match any of the paint samples from Christopher's house. There was no match of any fiber from Christopher's house. A pubic hair was found on Melissa's remains. Christopher willingly submitted his pubic hair samples. They didn't match. Head hair samples were found. Christopher submitted head hair samples. The head hair samples didn't match. The medical examiners in this case made DNA analysis of the head almost impossible because one of the medical examiners or anthropologists soaked it in bleach. But the technology still won out in the end. The plastic bags in which the remains have been kept were recently re-examined using the most powerful DNA testing available in modern times, detecting trace amounts of DNA. And sure enough, one of those bags returned a profile that was viable for testing against subjects. It said there were at least 5 human contributors touching this bag. 2 of them were male. Christopher submitted his DNA. It didn't match. So the state has some huge gaps it needs to fill. And here's how we anticipate that they're going to try to fill that gap. We expect the state will also call a witness who is somewhat of an expert in the area of domestic violence or abuse. Perhaps you think, well, there's no DNA, there's no fiber evidence, there's no trace evidence in the paint chips, the really important evidence must be in the domestic abuse. But just as with the DNA and the paint chips and the fiber, etc., the expert will offer no support for the prosecution's theory in this case, and here's why. She doesn't know anything about the case. She's never interviewed Chris. She's never read a single police report. She's never even talked to the DAs about the facts of this case. Instead, she's simply going to say that she is a domestic violence expert and tell you signs and symptoms of domestic violence. We anticipate that their testimony on those matters will do nothing to prove that Christopher Wolfenbarger is a cold-blooded murderer. She doesn't know anything about him. She knows nothing. And we will ask you when trial is over to reject that level of fake expert testimony. Another thing, the state's going to offer evidence to say Christopher was the last person to see Melissa alive in December of 1998. You've already heard it. But other evidence is going to show that Melissa's sister, Tina, actually saw her the following spring. At that time, Christopher had already long moved out of the area. Although Carl Patton was serving 5 life sentences in prison throughout this whole period up until he died last December, that did not stop Norma Patton from firmly expecting he would be paroled at some point. And she began looking into his parole within about 12 years after his life sentence had been served, his first out of 4 or 5. And the law technically at the time allowed for someone serving a life sentence to be eligible for parole after 14 years of service in prison. The evidence is going to show you that Norma operated on the belief that the only reason Carl had not been paroled was because his son-in-law, Christopher, had not yet been arrested. she will state explicitly out of her own mouth in a police interview that she believed that as soon as Christopher would be locked up, her husband would be released to come home. And she worked tirelessly for years with the DAs, with the police, and with media campaigns to make sure that happened. Ironically, the evidence will show that the investigators spent hardly any time at all investigating these other potential suspects. No hair samples were taken from them, no DNA samples were taken from them, no pubic hair samples, no searches of their homes, no paint chip samples taken from their houses. No one took DNA samples for this reason from the sister or the accused molester in her home or the friend down the road or anyone else. The evidence will show at most that Melissa somehow died and that someone tried to dispose of parts of her body. The evidence will show that everything beyond that is speculation and imagination. The evidence, as I said, won't show you a cause of death, a weapon, an instrument of death, an incident that led to her death, who dismembered or transported or scattered her remains. There will not be proof beyond a reasonable doubt in this case. There's no DNA, there's no high-powered technology, there's no expert testimony, there's no fiber evidence, no surveillance, no snitches, no co-conspirators, no confession, no eyewitnesses. The evidence will show that the state expects you to fill in all those missing gaps with your imagination. There is no evidence of these charges in this case, and that's why we will ask you at the end of this case to return a verdict of not guilty.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it's about 12:15, and so we are going to break for lunch, and when we return, we'll begin the evidence presentation portion of the trial. So it is 12:12. We're going to call it 12:15 and break until 1:15 for you to get lunch. Jurors are excused if the deputy will please escort them out of the room.
All right, for the jury.
May be seated. Any matters we need to put on the record before we also adjourn for lunch?
Not from the state.
Not from the defendants.
Okay. We are excused. If y'all, I don't know what the plan is for witness presentation, but I do we need to resolve the photographs issue when we return from lunch?
Yes, we did.
Okay. So that's after I said, I apologize. After I said you're excused, I realized I actually need you guys to come back at 12. I'm sorry, at 1 instead of 1:15, so that we'll just have a few minutes to talk through those issues. Thank you all. We are in recess until 1.